Thanks for staying with us. I hope you made some of the calls to some of your friends. And joining us now is Father Tad Pacholczyk. And Father, you've been on Catholic TV a number of times, and we are very grateful that you took time out of your busy schedule to be with us today, because it's very important.
Well, thank you, Jay, and Father. It's great to be with you again.
Well, you have a background in science and in theology. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, my background, I trained actually here in Boston, did some postdoctoral work at Harvard and Mass General, and got a fairly extensive science background before I went on to study theology in Rome. My background was in neuroscience, and in Rome then I sort of had the opportunity to switch into bioethics, medical ethics, studying questions around medicine and research and some of the complicated dilemmas that we face today. So I've now been working with the National Catholic Bioethics Center. I think it's about 8 years or so. Been wonderful work, travel around and speak on a lot of these life issues, issues of the dignity of the human person, and address different kinds of audiences, from priests to bishops to lay people, parishes, universities. I sometimes do debates, that kind of thing. So it's a very exciting area because science moves quickly, and the ethical questions that science raises also move rather quickly and challenge us, I think, to formulate our positions with greater clarity all the time.
Mm-hmm. And Father Tad, you're a very credible presenter of these very complex issues. That's why we're grateful to have you here today. We're talking about physician-assisted suicide. I have to ask you, what are the key reasons that a person would request assisted suicide from his or her doctor?
Yeah, I think that really there are several factors that you can usually identify here. One is sometimes there is mental illness, believe it or not. They find that there are issues of depression, sometimes manic depression, or some other cases of schizophrenia in individuals who request suicide in general. The statistics here are that if you struggle with schizophrenia, 8-fold higher risk that you'll die from suicide. And if you look at depression, it's about 20 times higher. So in the clinic, when people are dying, there are many reasons to be depressed, to struggle with depression, and one has to rule that out. One has to address, of course, the depression itself medically. And a lot of times there are people who have asked for it, and after they're treated, the fog of the depression lifts. They say, well, of course I didn't want assisted suicide. It was just I was in a hard place at that moment. Now, there are other reasons. Burdens. People say, I don't want to be a burden on others. My poor family, they're struggling with my illness. I really don't want to impose myself on them. And finally, I think the whole issue of suffering. Are people really willing to engage suffering and accept it? A lot of times we throw up avoidance mechanisms. Stay away from me, suffering. Mm-hmm. And then we turn to these what look like easy solutions in the face of suffering. So I think those are some of the reasons that people might ask for assisted suicide.
And I saw all of those in my friend David, who had ALS. He got depressed. He felt he was a burden. But he'd work through it. And with the support of his family and his children and his wife and his sisters and his mother.
And I think providing that supportive environment really is, in a sense, the rub here. Mm-hmm. This is the challenge that we face in providing medical care, to be able to say, are we really serious about caring for people, even when things start to get tough, when the going gets rough? And if we are, then we can provide pain management. We can provide, comfort to people who are very close to death. We can help them to make careful discernment about, look, isn't maybe this proposed surgery too much, over and above the top, and you're not morally required to choose it. This idea, I think that you mentioned it before the program, that, well, we've got to do everything to keep people going forever. Well, that's certainly not a Catholic position. Mm-hmm. Church has never said that. The Church is much more reasonable than people paint her to be about this issue, emphasizing that we need to use ordinary means of preserving our life, which just means we have to take care of the gift. The gift is a tremendous one, our own lives. And we instinctively protect ourselves, and we shouldn't be, stepping away from that basic duty, human duty, that we have in the face of a tremendous gift that we have received.
What are the basic elements, Father, of a good death?
You know, I think there are several. One would be certainly pain management. And, you know, good health care addresses that seriously. But I think there are other issues. You know, you want to find healing of relationships. You want to perhaps die in a place, you know, that you've chosen, if it's possible to do that. And sometimes it is. I think we have a lot of deaths that happen in hospitals, and sometimes it's not necessary that it be that way. People could go back home, die surrounded by family and friends with that supportive environment. You know, what a grace that is when death happens in that kind of a setting. I think, you know, there are other elements that are important. Avoiding these unduly burdensome kinds of treatments, and you know, having the discussions about that, and also about who would I like to make my decisions for me if I'm in a situation where I can't. You know, making sure you've had these discussions ahead of time, it gives you, what, a sense of control. And I think we all fear at the end that we're going to lose control. You know, we lose control of our bladders, we lose control of, you know, our bodily functions, and we're being cared for by others. And here, you know, we have all these opportunities to, in a sense, regain control in ways that are reasonable. And I think what happens with assisted suicide initiatives is people say, oh, this is just another way of controlling things, but it's not. It's a way of doing violence to ourselves and bringing harm to ourselves and harming all of those in those different circles around us. So, you know, the elements of a good death will be very sensitive to all those other considerations and help people to die in the right time. We all have a time, you know, that's appointed for that. And to be able to accept that and to provide that support, what a grace it is. And that's what I think good health care seeks to do.
When my sister Mara was dying, she had to have an amputation of her leg. Now, if she didn't get that amputation, she would die. The infection would continue and she would die. And she was very depressed. She didn't know what to do. And I remember sitting down with Mara and I said, Mara, you know, I love you. And if you were to die today, I would miss you. And she was struggling with it because she was suffering so badly. And she decided to have the surgery. And I cannot tell you the wonderful moments we had, Mara and myself as a brother or sister, and with the rest of my sisters and my parents, with Mara. That extra time that we got with her, it was incredible. And she was thrilled that she finally had decided to go forward.
Yeah, that's a great story. You know, and I mean, you're making such an important point here about how, in a sense, assisted suicide cuts off a whole future for us. And, you know, it reminds me of a story that I think I mentioned to you briefly at one point when we were talking earlier about a friend of mine from Canada. And he at a certain point a number of years ago got a diagnosis that he had MS. And he sent me a picture recently of him in his wheelchair, but with two of his grandkids sitting on the wheelchair. And he wrote to me, I'm going to read you what he wrote
great.
because it's just so powerful. He said, if I had opted for assisted suicide back in the mid-1980s when I first developed MS, and it seemed life as I knew it was over, look what I would have missed. I had no idea that one day I would be head over heels in love with grandchildren. Never give up on life. Wow. You know, it's such a powerful reminder to us of all the goods that, you know, we don't know the time the Lord has for us here, and we need to always be open to, you know, being, to working with Him towards that final demise in the way that He wants. And even the way that we die, He works in graces along the way. And you mentioned some of those, you know, in your family, and He obviously points out how powerfully they've played out in His family.
But we live in a free country. Isn't it our choice to determine when we die?
You know, that's a great question. And I mean, we all love freedom. We all love choice. And we say the freedom to choose. But I think it's always important that we finish the sentence. Freedom to choose what? Freedom to choose violence against myself? Freedom to choose death for myself? Is that a good? That's not a good. I think the challenge here is to say to people, look, life is a gift that we have received, and when you receive a gift like this, you have responsibilities. And part of those responsibilities involve recognizing that you should never choose to treat something good as if it were an evil. That's always a mistake if we do that. That's always what we call bad moral choice, bad moral choosing. And if you choose to act against your own life, to cause your own death by ingesting poisonous drugs, that's always a disordered kind of a choice. That's treating something good, your life, as if it's bad, and it's not bad. It has some difficulties, there's some suffering, there's some challenges there. But you've got to, in a sense, rise above those challenges. And the beauty of it is that we're free creatures who can choose to do that. You remember the old phrase that our grandmothers always taught us? Offer it up.
Oh, yeah.
You know?
I was wondering where you're going to go with
Yeah,
that.
a beautiful phrase, you know? And that's what really, in a sense, ennobles us, even in very difficult circumstances, in suffering, in trials. It changes us inwardly when we do that. And, you know, we as Catholics especially, we have always the image of the crucifix before us. You know, and what terrible suffering that was that the Lord took upon himself. But we know, mysteriously woven into that, in the designs of God, there were some redemptive purposes that were, you know, important for the whole world. And when each of us die, there are little redemptive purposes woven into it as well. You know, it's difficult, but when we rise up and offer that up to the Lord, it's a beautiful thing, and it really heals many others around us. It heals relationships in families, and makes us ready then to, you know, meet the Lord.
Why is assisted suicide itself a wrong kind of act, an act that should never be freely chosen?
You know, that's a great question, and I think really if we want to kind of put this in the simplest terms, I often remind people of the sad truth that an American dies from suicide about once every 17 seconds.
I didn't know that.
It's a staggering statistic.
Wow.
And more Americans die from suicide than from car accidents. And, you know, many people do it, for example, by going up on a bridge and jumping off. Now, how do we respond to that as a society? Well, we put signs up on the bridge that say, if you're thinking about doing this, please call us. And, you know, we have people maybe who walk the bridges and try to find people they can talk down. And we say somebody who does that, they're a hero. You know, they're saving lives. So there's a consistent cultural message that we send about suicide. Now, if we choose to allow physician-assisted suicide, we speak in direct contradiction to that cultural message. I mean, it's almost as if we say, you know, consult your doctor as to whether jumping would make sense for you. We don't ever want to send that kind of message. And certainly the medical profession should never be involved in that. The medical profession is, you know, cutting against the grain of its own identity anytime that it chooses to do that.
Doesn't this put doctors in a very difficult position, too? Because they take an oath to sustain life, and now they're putting this position where they have to take it.
You know, the oath is an interesting angle here, because in the past, you're right, they took the Hippocratic Oath, but you know what? Unfortunately, when abortion became legal, they discontinued taking the Hippocratic Oath. And so doctors are already kind of struggling with certain elements of, you know, doing one thing and saying another and so on. And this assisted suicide measure will only make it worse. We need to call people back to the Hippocratic Oath, which had very clear prohibitions against giving poisonous substances to people, even if they asked you for it. A doctor knew he couldn't do that.
I have to ask you, while we're talking about doctors and poisonous substances, I was a little appalled when I did a little research of my own online to see how this physician-assisted suicide actually it happens, because, you know, I had the impression it was just a pill and you take it and then you go to sleep, but it's not as easy as that. Could you explain what happens, what a doctor prescribes?
Well, yeah, a doctor prescribes a lethal dose of a substance, and in the current formulation of the law, it's not required that there be anybody there to witness. For example, when the individual takes this, they take this high dose, end their life, and, you know, it's sad in a sense that there isn't a requirement. I mean, this is an isolating event. The person is lonely, they're desperate, they're struggling with all kinds of issues, and then they're taking it upon themselves in that isolation to end their own lives. We should rather be providing a matrix of support to people, that they don't feel they have to isolate themselves in that way.
Well, you're going to hear the argument all the time, and we already hear it. Well, my aunt, you know, my grandmother or my mother or my father, they're suffering so much, and this would just relieve all of that for them.
Yeah, and you hear them say something like,
yeah.
they're ready to die, and they're saying that they're ready to go. And that's a particularly difficult one, I think, because, I mean, I've seen it myself in dealing with people where people do say, you know, Father, I'm ready to go, and I hope the Lord takes me soon. And that's okay to feel that way, and it, you know, you can hope the Lord will take you, but we can certainly never, in a sense, force the Lord's hand here and say it's got to be on my terms, not the Lord's terms. So, you know, I think getting people to approach death with a certain equanimity of spirit, with a certain kind of level-headedness, it's hard when the suffering is there and the pain is there. But that's why good palliative care, good hospice care well done, what a blessing it is.
Sure.
Yeah, and we need more, you know, awareness of that and more kind of fidelity to the mission of good hospice. Because there are circumstances where you realize time is short, we really don't need to try heroics, but let's be sure we're caring for people as their clock winds down.
Now, our hope, obviously, is that this ballot question will not pass. But what happens to society if it does?
You know, it's a good question, too, because I'm afraid politically this may be kind of one of a series of dominoes that we may be looking at here. I mean, there are discussions about reintroducing into Vermont a legislative initiative, not to the voters directly, but just to the lawmakers, that previously was defeated there. Because, you know, in Vermont, they may look down at Massachusetts and say, look what they did in Boston. I mean, we've got to follow suit. And then some other dominoes. You know, New York, there's discussion of reintroducing some initiatives there. California, maybe. New Mexico, one or two others. And then, you know, soon what do you have? You have kind of a preponderance, or you have a majority. And then maybe you get the federal government involved and some kind of, you know, imposition from above, as we saw happen with abortion. Abortion started in various states, here and there, and then it went up to the Supreme Court and was, you know, given the green light there, unfortunately. So I hope we don't have anything like that that follows. But I think it's very important here in the Commonwealth that, you know, people become aware of this and understand that Massachusetts, also because Massachusetts is such a technological state, there's so much healthcare, there's so much research that goes on here, that if you can get it to change here, it's likely to be a trigger elsewhere.
Well, Father Tad, thank you so much for joining us today and filling us in. And